Welcome to the RevOps Lab, a podcast exploring the art and science of revenue operations. To find more episodes and resources on scaling your revenue engine, visit getweflow.com/RevOps.
Welcome to another episode of the RevOps Lab. But before we dive in, are you using Einstein Activity Capture and struggle to report and analyze your activity data? Or are you using Salesforce for Outlook or Gmail and miss activities because logging them is manual and time-consuming? Hundreds of revenue teams face the same challenges and solve them with Weflow, a Salesforce activity capture solution. Weflow auto-captures emails, meetings, and contacts and permanently stores them in Salesforce. This way, you can run activity reports, build automations, and get better insights. With Weflow's admin console, you have a central place to implement and configure your setup in under 30 minutes. Visit getweflow.com/activity to learn more and get your free trial. Thanks, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the we're here with Soham Maniar. I hope I pronounced this correctly. Welcome, Soham.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we had a really good chat, I think, a few weeks ago about signal-based outbound, and the topic that, in my mind, is actually something that has been around for a long time. At the same time, was really, really challenging to do 10 years ago, 5 years ago. And probably only the most sophisticated outbound teams have done that. But now it's being democratized, and I think that was kind of the initial conversation. And you just basically really revamped your outbound strategy around this theme. So this is the topic for today, and let's maybe kick off with who are you, what do you do, and then we dive right into the topic. So yeah, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So my name is Soham. I've been kind of in the RevOps space for my entire career in some way, shape, or form. So I started out my career in Salesforce implementation at a company called Blue Wolf, and that kind of led me down the systems and tools route at Twitter. And from there, I spent some time at large and small companies, kind of moving up the ranks in revenue operations, where today I now lead revenue operations at Weaviate. Um, and yeah, I mean, I've been in the RevOps space for like I said, my whole career. So I've seen it change quite a bit from being a very reactive type of org to now really not just a cost center, but a revenue generating center. If you structure it right and you think about it right. And so it's been really great to see RevOps grow. As far as what I own at Weaviate, it's kind of two distinct functions that overlap. One is typical kind of RevOps things. So uh, making sure that we have the systems and tools for our sales teams to function correctly. From a go-to-market strategy perspective, how are we forecasting, generating pipeline? What markets are we in? What are we not doing? All of that kind of fun stuff. Process-wise, deal desk, all those typical things that fall into the process bucket. And then I think the other distinct bucket that I own that's probably pretty unusual, but has a lot to do with the signal-based outbound is owning our sales development function. So our kind of junior sales reps who are responsible for booking meetings, reaching out to prospects, and doing all of that stuff. I hired our first one. Now our team has three, and they all report to me, which is fairly unusual, but pretty fun, and I've learned a lot. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
I love this. So you combine the ops world with the having a back, as we say, world, right? So who better to talk to about this topic than you? And let's maybe kick off with like, how would you define signal-based outbound?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you said something really important earlier, which is it's not anything new fundamentally, right? From the beginning of prospecting and selling software, uh, sellers have been keyed in on this, whether they realize it or not. And some have just done it better than others. And really, at its core, all it is finding people who are as high up on the awareness and intent curve as possible so that your sale is as easy as possible and you don't have to warm these prospects up. That's really all it's ever been. Why it's different today and why it's kind of getting this new term or being coined slightly differently is because there are tools and platforms and ways in which you can ingest this signal that did not exist before. And I don't think it has to do with AI or anything that's kind of like in the last 18 months. But I would say in the last 3 to 4 years, people have started to be a little bit smarter about defining their own awareness and intent curves as they overlap on their ACPs and kind of TAM, I guess, at large. And what that really allows them to do is focus intentional on the right customers who are already aware of their product, their space, what they're selling, why it helps, so that when you do reach out, um, it's as easy as humanly possible. So signal-based outbound today is really being able to understand what those trigger points are for you and your business that tell you someone is as close to ready to buy as possible, and then reaching out at that time, as opposed to educating and building awareness.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's beautifully put, I think. And I think something everybody looks for, right? Like, how can we know who is in market and actually knows us, loves us, trusts us, and is just not booking that demo for some reason? And then we nudge them and they're like, "Oh, thank you so much that you reached out. This is a wonderful message. I've been actually waiting for you." And yeah, I actually been thinking about buying your product a long time ago, and I think in between very cold and I don't know you and there's some shape or form of message, and this there's obviously a lot of like way in between. Um, so I think I'd love to spend some time on like kind of going through like how do you actually identify the right signals, right? Like, and I think you said something very important. Those signals are in context of your business and your go to market, so they probably vary a lot. But maybe we can use your company as an example and then abstract from there.
Yeah, great question. So I'll frame it two different ways, right? I think there's, generally speaking, for any software company, there's some universal signals that just kind of matter. And to me, there's two forms of those. One is your website. Every software company ever in history has had a website. Now, tracking has gotten kind of logistically and compliance wise a little bit more challenging, but you're still able to do it and say which companies are viewing certain pages on my website. And then you can work backwards to say certain pages have more of a tendency to tell me that someone is aware and ready to buy. That's pretty standard, universal. Anybody can do it, even if you started your company tomorrow. The other is product usage, and that one obviously varies based on kind of your company and your product and what it does. But at the end of the day, if you are selling a software product, you should be able to understand the motions in which people are in the pathways in which they enter your product, and what a successful kind of entry point looks like, and what a neutral entry point and what a bad entry point looks like. And I can talk more about that later when we dive into kind of product usage metrics that matter. But to me, product usage and website is, if you were to have a 1 day old company or a 1 week old company, you should be able to start somewhere there because it's anybody can do it. So that's kind of one of the signals that could work for anybody. Um, the other signals are very kind of channel and business maturity dependent. So, anybody that's listening to this, take it with a grain of salt and really apply the logic to your business. But some context on Weaviate, right? So it's an AI native vector database. Since 2019, it's been open source and it still continues to be open source today. So for me, the learning curve was, there are so many different channels of this business, and each of them comes with its own set of signals. And we can even talk about stacking signals later. But the more channels, the better, because the more channels, the more signals. And so for us, we have a few different ones. We have open source. We have kind of a PLG, free to paid motion, but the free motion is kind of its own thing. So people can sign up for a sandbox. It lives for 14 days. You can play around with it. You can extend it 3 times, and then at the end of that, you kind of lose access to your data, and you got to make a choice. There's serverless, which is almost like our pay as you go monthly, and you pay as little as $25 a month to use some of our basic functionality, and you can use that forever. And it scales up and down with the amount of data volume that you store. And then the last is kind of enterprise. So Weaviate Enterprise Cloud is probably our newest product. It's existed for less than 2 years, and it's really when we started to consider ourselves a proper enterprise business. So across those 4 channels, I think some businesses are lucky if they have 1 or 2 channels, and we have 4. Uh, a fifth if you actually just count marketing kind of as its own channel in terms of the collateral that exists you could argue it's a layer on top of all of those because it feeds into each of those. But for the sake of signal, you could almost say marketing collateral, the website, all of that is its own set of signals as well. So what makes Weaviate a really interesting business from a signal perspective is exactly that, which is I have all the options. So I spent this first I've been here about 9 months. I spent the first 3 to 4 months before we really brought in any BDRs to go action this stuff, just understanding what signals we have at our disposal. So to kind of quickly answer your question and dive into some of the specifics, open source is a really interesting one. So there's plenty of tools. You can even do it kind of your own way, depending on the technical resources that you have at your disposal. But we have a tool called Scarf, where there's a pixel that sits on top of our open source packages. And really all it does is it de-anonymizes the companies that are using us open source. And so then we're able to go dive in and figure out which companies are using us open source, at what level, at what scale. That in and of itself, even if you weren't to stack that with anything else, is a really interesting channel for us. So we can go figure out, which of those companies are using us heavily and start to unpack why and what they're building. So that's kind of open source just as one channel. Um, Sandbox and serverless all bucket together. And really that's just pure product usage, right? So how many people are signing up from certain companies? What are they doing in their first day? What are they doing in their first 30 days? Candidly, this is where we're like the least mature, but I would argue is like one of the most important places to really double down and understand, because when you think about that awareness curve again, who are the people that are the most mature? The ones that are already using your product. And then one layer above that, the ones that are using your product extremely well. Those are the ones where your level of effort and energy that you have to put in to convert them is the least. So, that's kind of like the product usage section. Then there's sort of the enterprise side of things. And really, enterprise is the best example of stacking signals across everything, because any enterprise seller can tell you that you just don't have one signal from one person unless it's like an inbound form submission that says, please, I'm ready to pay, which sometimes happens. But any enterprise seller will tell you it took them a long history of unpacking all the different things that happen. And that's where signal-based selling becomes really, really interesting. So a fun one that I can kind of mention that's interesting for us, and then I'll pause, is GitHub. So we have, through a tool that we use called Common Room, there's plenty of other tools out there that kind of do this sort of thing, but you can basically plug in your own GitHub repo if you're an open source platform, and then see which users are starring, forking, commenting, building on your repo, which is a huge signal for an open source company to be able to say, what are the developers doing within my repo? So, that's a great signal for us. It turns up quite a lot in and of itself. And then when you stack it with open source usage, website visits, right? I view that signal based selling as it really becomes putting a puzzle together, which is for this type of company, what is the order of operations that tells me someone is ready to buy? Is it open source usage for X number of weeks? And then they come to our technical documentation and view a certain blog. And then they do this and that and the other thing, and finally land at product usage. And we can see that journey through and through, which makes it super interesting to kind of learn from.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, please keep talking. I think like you just doing a monologue here is like working perfectly fine for this podcast episode.
Yeah,
Perfectly
absolutely.
but still, like I'll try to fulfill my duty as a host and ask you a question. But no, like I think I mean what you said right in the beginning, I think like a big piece, and I think this is probably like one big challenge that many companies face, is this first step is the de-anonymization. And then to do it in a way that it doesn't feel like too artificial, or like a blocker, like you create like this artificial gateway that then the customer has to jump through. Like I think like the most basic example here is probably like gated content, like download our cheat sheet, but please enter your email address first, right? So this is one of those, which is really annoying. And then but also I think one tactic that is not so commonly deployed or like used anymore. And then like once you've done this, like for example the pixel, right? I think this is like super elegant and like a really good way of doing it. And I think also just looking at the product stats and so on, then to figure out, okay, what actually then is a sort of like what is actually then a good signal. So now you are able to like to collect the data and then actually look at all the different potential signals, and then to figure out, okay, which of these signals is real, or basically, how to put it, like is worth, like, doubling down on because it generates the highest conversion rate. And that part, that's something I'm curious about, and I would like to dig a little bit deeper into, because I feel like this is actually not so easy. So let's say you de-anonymize, and then there's like lots of stuff going on suddenly in the product, like hundreds of companies starting to use, like, the repository and so on, building their own stuff. And like, where do you start? Like,
Yeah.
how do you actually figure this out?
We asked the community how they capture activities in Salesforce. The result? Almost 2/3 of you use Einstein Activity Capture or Salesforce for Gmail and Outlook. And while it's great that you care about activity capture, those solutions can be quite problematic. For example, running reports and analyzing your activity data is often a nightmare with Einstein Activity Capture. And those who use Salesforce for Outlook or Gmail often miss activities because logging them is manual and time-consuming for your reps. That's why we built Weflow, a Salesforce activity capture solution. Hundreds of revenue teams use Weflow to auto-capture emails, meetings, and contacts. Weflow then permanently stores your activities in Salesforce so you can run activity reports, build automations, and get better insights. You can even sync past activities for up to 24 months. And with our admin console, you have full control over your setup. The best thing about Weflow? You're up and running in less than 30 minutes. So visit getweflow.com/activity to learn more and get your free trial today. Thanks, and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, not that we figured it out, in some perfect way, but I think it like with many things, there's a gray area, and it all depends on kind of what you're looking to optimize for. So what I mean by that is, certain signals, my opinion is standalone signals are only helpful if you're looking to see what they convert to immediately after. So as an example is, you shouldn't look at people who just hit the pricing page as a standalone signal to try to pattern recognize anything, unless you're looking to say, by that channel of that signal, how many people turn into a stage one opportunity, right? If you want to see exactly what happened on the other side of that kind of hill, then it's a helpful exercise to say, okay, well, we had 500 people hit the pricing page and 5 of them turned into stage one opportunities just from that pricing page visit. Then the signal in and of itself is something you can key off of and double down on or cut if it's not helping. Um, when you kind of take a step back, again, it's just my opinion based on what I'm seeing, at least for our business, is very, you're never going to see an enterprise deal get to a closed won state off of just one or two signals. It tends to be multiple signals across multiple people over a very long period of time. So that's where you have to kind of be a little, it's more art than science, but it's both, to really understand what are all the different ways in which people can engage with your company and then kind of tier them. So I almost imagine a pyramid where the tier one kind of signals are things that correlate directly to them building in the product or engaging in buying activities. So if they download a pricing guide, that's a gated piece of content, and there's a product sign up, right? So these are all and statements, not or. Within each tier, there's and statements. Among the tiers, then you can try to figure out the or statements if that makes sense. So there's those tier one things for your business that when somebody does it, they're pretty much ready to buy, and there shouldn't be very many of them. Um, and then there's kind of the tier two things, which tell you they're very aware of your business, your space. Maybe they're working with a competitor, all that kind of stuff. So you know that there's no need to really validate, but it's more just convince. And then there's the validate tier, which is, they might just be hitting your website and just starring your GitHub repo and liking a few social posts. Those are all surface level things. It's not nothing, but it's helpful to know that where they sit on that awareness curve. So back to your point, right? Figuring out what converts to closed one, it becomes much more than just a signal game because at some point your sales reps step in and there's multiple people involved in the process and it becomes much more than just what signal brought them in the door. So to me, it's always about exactly that, which is what signals brought them in the door, willing to have a conversation. Signals are just that. They're just a handle to the door, right? That's all they are. They're not going to help close the deal because I think that is much more than a signal at that point.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah. I mean, like, one of those things is like, how often did someone open an email, right? Um,
Sure.
like that's that's maybe one of the weaker signals here.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
so some value there, but I mean, don't freak out over it. If someone who opened the email
Right.
30 times, like that could mean a lot of different things.
Yeah,
Um,
you have to operate with a very healthy level of skepticism when it comes to signals, right? I think companies that are overly optimistic about the signals they see and the results they see from signals, you're probably missing something very obvious when it comes to the other side of it. So I think there's a healthy level of skepticism that should be had when you're dealing with any of these signals, because people think about how I always put myself in the end user's perspective. Just think about your typical day. You work in tech, you're coming across 10 to 12 websites in a day. You're clicking things, you're downloading things, you're liking posts. I don't even realize I do it half the time, right? And I'm just kind of doing things because I'm down a pathway. But subconsciously, there's probably 2 to 3 vendors I'm considering for something right now, whether it's a forecasting tool or pipeline management tool, whatever, what have you. Subconsciously, I am doing things in and around that sphere, and I may not even realize that I'm hitting the same pricing page 3 times in a week. Those are the signals you want to pay attention to. So if you're ever stuck, whoever's listening to this, if you're ever stuck trying to figure out what signals matter, take a step back and put yourself in the shoes of what do you do day to day and how are you interacting with these things? And you might see some reality around like your interaction with what you would consider to be signals and what's real and what's
Yeah.
not.
so
I
would
think
you,
what you
sorry.
described earlier is actually a beautiful description of the awareness funnel is very fuzzy. And I think that's the reality uh, for anyone who's been in marketing, right? Like knowing that you need X touch points and they will come from many different areas. But then, right, like I think what you're basically describing, because I think the website combined with product usage data is very down the funnel already, right? Where I mean, yes, some companies have the luxury of that data. I mean, website data for sure, but like product usage data, not so much if you're not product led or open source, right? This is very specific to your example. But let's say you're sales led and you sell to the enterprise, right? Like, how do you even do it, right? And I think uh, how I understand you is like you stack multiple signals together to basically say, okay, look, I mean, they looked at our pricing page, they did an interactive product tour on our website. We see density across the account. We see recurring users, and and then maybe my question then is like, do you look at signals in context of like context or accounts or both, and how do you orchestrate those? Yeah.
Good question. I mean, I think where we are right now, we see so much potential in front of us that it's more on the account level. And so I think what we're like circling around a little bit here in this conversation is this concept of like scoring and prioritization, right? Because when you stack signals, inevitably what you come up with is kind of tiered breakdown of if you have 100,000 accounts in your database that you could sell to, and you start to score them all across the same criteria, you'll start to see that 10% are excellent and 25% are whatever, and then the rest are all terrible, right? So then it's giving you some sort of area to focus your prioritization on, um, based on behavior and not just fit, right? And I think that's a super important point too, just to kind of segue, which is typically how people have tackled this space prior to signals and behavior and AI and kind of some of the things that allow you to tap into behavior now, is just firmographic fit. And we've all understood ICP, and people go through that whole ICP definition exercise multiple times through the journey of their company to say how many engineers do they have and how many XYZ do they have and like all that kind of stuff and how much funding. And those are all surface level firmographic data that I see as old world. Now, it's not valuable, but I think it needs to be blended with behavior. So back to your question around kind of stacked signals and what does that really mean in reality? It's just a prioritization framework, right? At the end of the day, which is which companies am I seeing a ton of noise from? And I actually really like your phrasing there, which is density, right? I think that's actually the best way to describe it, the best adjective for what we're talking about, which is the accounts with the most density and noise are the ones where you should be focusing your attention because your reps will spend the least amount of time selling to them and the most amount of time guiding them along a journey that they're already on, right? That's really, I think, what it comes down to at the end of the day. And so how we use that in real life at Weaviate is kind of the accounts that we have our sales reps focus on are all signal based and scoring based. Now, hand raisers come in and random accounts pop up on our LinkedIn's and seem like they could be a good fit. And you always want to keep some space for that. But we're not doing the typical add heads as we want to enter new territories and then just hope that we sell enough into that territory. Right. I think we're trying to approach it a slightly different way. And it all stems from this concept of signal and noise. And we'll see how it works.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, how do you, right? So I think some of the listeners will now basically ask themselves, okay, there's even specific tools you can use to get signals, right, in the open source example or GitHub. How do you orchestrate that? Like, how do you layer it today, right? And then how do you, I mean, because I think in my mind, right, it's a prioritization for time spent of SDRs or XDRs, right? And then the question is, what channels do the XDRs use that actually work? But let's maybe table that for now, and first go into the orchestration layer, right? Because I think a lot of people now listen to this. It's like, okay, well, that's great. I have all these different signals in all different places. Like, how do I actually bring it together so that then people can act on it, right, in their engagement tools or whatever they're using? Yeah?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when I hear the word orchestration, I think of a couple different things, which is kind of enrichment, which is kind of like an always on topic forever and ever. Short answer here is, every tool does enrichment now. So just pick one, right? Like I'm not really on the boat of there's this best, you got to do waterfall and you got to do it through clay. Like they're all good. Figure out your budget and figure out what works. If you have the budget for a Zoom info, go do a Zoom info. If you have the budget for only a clay monthly plan, then do a clay monthly plan. But enrichment is always frankly, it's not my favorite thing to work on because it's always kind of just like a cost cutting exercise and what can we do? What's the most we can do with very little exercise? But it's unfortunately part of the game. And there's like nothing you can do about it. So I like to just have people who really are smarter about it than I am work on it because I'm probably not the best person, but it's a necessary evil. But it points to the bigger thing around orchestration, which is kind of how do you activate these signals through channels, I guess is how I think of the word orchestration. Um, at the end of the day, it's part experiment and part collaborating with marketing and your leadership to understand your tone and your tone of voice of your company that you want to have and the brand that you want to portray. And what I mean by that is, if you're okay having a brand of high volume, high noise, but we're always there and we're always in front of you when you're ready to make the decision, go email, right? And go deep down the automating your email with custom variables and Clay and AI agents and whatever you want to do. If it's very targeted to people who are already kind of out in public, but it's a professional place, then you can go with the LinkedIn. If it's less professional and more casual, you go with the X or Twitter. Right. So I think it really is, there's no one answer. And ultimately you have to do all the channels. What I will say is, calling is making a comeback for sure. And there's great tools out there in terms of phone calls like Orem, Nooks, all the tools. But across, I think any successful go-to-market org today needs to have a prospecting first mentality and not just for XDRs, but for everybody. Um, I think hot take is like to the point of I communicate at large to the whole company. If you see anything on LinkedIn, whether you're an engineer or CEO or anybody, if you see anything on LinkedIn, if you know anybody that's talking about RAG or semantic search or anything like that, call it out in our GTM channel, and we'll find the right salesperson to connect you to because you just never know where these things come from today. And there's no one right channel. So that's kind of the high level on the channel. I can give like a specific example, right? I think one that a lot of people have talked about. There's Brendan Short is someone who is pretty big in this space. Uh, he now runs his own kind of agency where he does a lot of this stuff in terms of orchestration. So shout out to him if you guys need help. He's probably always busy, but he's really really helpful. But something he's done that works really well, and it's kind of like an autopilot signal is the website visitor one. So when somebody from within your ICP hits the website, specifically the pricing page, there's no reason for anybody to kind of sit there and manually think about the message that goes out, right? And again, this all comes within what brand tone of voice you want to have, but a really easy win is setting up an automated website visitor play and say, hey, if this company has stacked signals across other stuff, you can filter it down as narrow as you want. But if this company is within our ICP with X amount of revenue and X employees, but also has a product sign up in the last 90 days, and then they hit our pricing page, send them this canned message, right? So you want to work backwards from the message you want to send and what you're looking to accomplish. And then you can just figure out which signal pathways to filter it down through. You can do that with virtually any signal. You can do add GitHub repo star, people who have done that with viewed our technical documentation in the last 90 days and send them down exactly the pathway in terms of what they should be learning about our product next, because you know what that persona looks like, right? So you can get very creative with it, but the way to orchestrate it is just start with something, right? I kind of had that same moment for myself where I didn't really know where to start. And then I talked to Brendan and he was like, just get the website visitor ones out the door, right? And we have some level of consistent meetings that come through that every quarter where nobody's really doing any work. It just comes out automatically when someone hits the pricing page.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's super smart. Makes a lot of sense. And so, yeah, I think it's just what you should do with these automations, as many automations as possible, because I think it's also about speed, right? So somebody goes to a pricing page, it's currently top of mind, so it's important to react quickly. I think you hear this all the time with sales, and I think it's just so true.
Yeah.
And automations are the way to guarantee that, even like if it's 1 a.m. Um, somewhere.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
controlled, right? You don't
yeah.
you take human error out of it, I think is the main benefit.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. Before we close, just curious, like, what are some of like the top mistakes that you maybe made, like on your journey, like things you can, share with our listeners that you would say, like, hey, like definitely avoid these 1, 2, 3 things that I totally failed at, if you wanna share.
Yeah, I think number one mistake is not, this may sound obvious, but not setting up the metrics that you want to measure yourself against before you go start building. It's very hard in an operational capacity when you get dropped in the middle of a huddle of sales reps asking you to create fields and CEO asking for strategy and vision on XYZ and marketing is asking for your help on attribution. And that's just the nature of the role at RevOps. You just get dropped in the middle of those conversations in day one, especially as you have a little bit more tenure. The most beneficial thing you can do when you're in a RevOps role, and especially with everything we just talked about, is pick some metrics. Just start somewhere and measure yourself against them. But just put it on paper, because the worst thing you can do is spend 3 months. And I did it here, and I've done it all the other jobs, and it never seemed to learn. But I'll preach anyways, which is the worst thing you can do is just go attack problems, because it's very easy to just go tackle the low hanging fruit. But set yourself up for success. Set up boundaries. Set up a framework in which you want to operate and be successful, and you're going to be much happier at the 6 to 8 month mark when you have something to compare against, because you can always tweak. So that's the number one thing that comes to mind. The other that comes to mind is kind of vendor bloat and head on a swivel. Like, there's way too many tools out there, and the worst thing you can do is spend your time all day talking to new vendors. Your time is extremely valuable when you're a RevOps person, especially at a startup, and all the different things you have to be doing. You need focus time to go build and test and iterate. If you're talking to 2 to 3 AI companies every week about their new way of doing XYZ, you're gonna burn all your time, and that company may not be around 6 months from now, or they may pivot, and then you're just like, what did I do all this for? So understand your problems really, really well, because I guarantee you can solve 80% of them with tools that have existed forever, right? It's not like the problems are new because the tools are new. The problems are always the same problems. The tools just may give you a 5% better way of solving it, or save you 10% of the time. But really be staunch in understanding your problems and what the right solution looks like. And the tools likely don't matter much at the end of the day. They all kind of do the same things.
Only difference is obviously Weflow, the revenue
Of course,
intelligence
Weflow is the
platform,
only
right?
difference,
That's
but
obviously right. Like there's an exception here, but like I fully agree on the tool approach side and
yeah, yeah,
consolidating the space for sure.
absolutely.
Um, yeah, awesome. We unfortunately have a hard stop today, and I joined late. I honestly think Philip was alluding to this earlier. super, super valuable episode. And I think we could have gone a lot deeper also. Yeah.
Let's just do a
So
second one.
yeah, let's do a second one.
Let's do it.
I really enjoyed it. I think it's such an important topic, and yeah, thank you so much for joining and sharing this. But last question:
Sure.
any book you would recommend, or any blog, or any industry report, anything people can learn from? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned this at the top of the call. I'm not a huge book reader, so you can forgive me for that one. But in terms of blogs, like there's a lot of great ones out there. I tend to focus my attention away from the tactical kind of like RevOps blogs. Although, Giannis, I will give you a shout out. Your content is amazing, and I'm not just saying that because I'm on here. It's the reason that I reached out to you. I think anything in that sphere where people give real advice and talk about how to solve real problems is ultra helpful. That being said, RevOps is a stressful role, something that I find really helpful. It's a blog called Ultra Successful by Dr. Julie Gerner. I think she's on Substack, so I just subscribe to that. It's free. Really, really solid content there. And yeah, for anybody that's feeling burnt out, stressed out, it's always a nice level set. And there's some good stuff in it.
Perfect. Thank you
Awesome.
so much.
Thank you so much for joining. Looking forward to the next one, and wish you a great day.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the RevOps Lab podcast. Please consider to like and subscribe our show and give us a 5-star rating on wherever you're listening. If you have feedback or suggestions, let us know at podcast@getweflow.com. We read and reply to every email. Thank you.